It was the kind of bitterly cold winter night that made the air feel like shards of glass on your skin. The sky above was pitch black, with the occasional flicker of stars barely cutting through the thick, overbearing clouds. I remember gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white, my breath fogging up the windshield as I cursed under my breath. Of all the nights for this to happen, it had to be tonight. My name's Emily, just an ordinary 18-year-old freshman trying to navigate my first year of college. Winter break had finally arrived, and I was more than ready to be back home, away from the stress of finals and the overwhelming chaos of campus life. My plan was simple: a 4-hour drive through mostly rural roads, get home, kick my feet up, and enjoy a few weeks of quiet. But of course, things rarely go according to plan. I was in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, when my car sputtered and jerked forward. The gas gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 30 minutes, but I foolishly believed I could make it to the next station. I guess this is what I get for pushing my luck. The car coasted to a stop, the engine giving one last pathetic wheeze before dying altogether. I sat there in silence for a moment, the realization settling in. There were no street lights, no passing cars, just the faint hum of the wind rattling the bare branches of trees that lined the road. My phone was dead, of course. No charger, no service even if I had one. Perfect. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and tried to think. There was nothing for miles. Walking wasn't an option in this freezing cold, especially not on foot with no clear direction. I was stuck, and panic was beginning to creep in. My mind ran through all the stories I'd heard about people stranded on desolate roads. Most of them didn't end well. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself that I was overreacting. But the silence was deafening, and I was completely, utterly alone. About 20 minutes passed before I saw the headlights. Relief washed over me, and I started waving frantically as the car approached. I couldn't make out much from the glare of the lights, but I could tell it was an old, beat-up sedan. It slowed down, and eventually rolled to a stop right beside me. The driver's side window creaked open, and a man leaned out. "Car trouble?" he asked. His voice was low, almost a growl, and immediately I felt a chill run down my spine. "Yeah," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Ran out of gas." He paused for a second, then gave me a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lucky for you I'm headed into town. You need a ride?" I hesitated. Every instinct in me screamed to say no, but what choice did I have? It was freezing, my phone was useless, and the chances of someone else coming by tonight were slim to none. He seemed like my only option. "Yeah, thanks," I said, opening the passenger door. The inside of the car smelled faintly of gasoline and something else, something off. I couldn't quite place it, but it immediately set me on edge. The man didn't say much as we started driving, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I glanced over at him, trying to get a read. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with thinning hair and a rugged face that looked like it had seen a lot of hard years. His clothes were dirty, like he'd been working outside all day. There was something about the way he carried himself that made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "So, how far is the next gas station?" I asked, trying to make small talk. "Not far," he replied curtly, eyes fixed on the road. The conversation died after that. I sat in silence, my mind racing. I watched the road ahead, but the more we drove, the more it became clear that something wasn't right. We weren't headed toward any town, as far as I could tell. The road was getting narrower, the trees thicker. My heart started pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Then I heard it. A thump. From the trunk. I froze, my eyes darting to the man, but he didn't react. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. But then it happened again, a distinct, muffled thump, followed by what sounded like a faint, distant cry. My stomach lurched, and I tried to stay composed, but my hands were shaking. I needed to get out of the car. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. He didn't answer. He just kept driving, his jaw clenched tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel even harder. The sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't my imagination. Something, was in the trunk. "Pull over," I said, my voice wavering. "I think I'm gonna be sick." The man shot me a quick glance, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to stop. But then, almost reluctantly, he slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. I didn't wait. As soon as the car came to a halt, I yanked the door open and stumbled out, pretending to heave. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. The cold air hit me like a punch to the gut, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating tension inside that car. The man didn't get out. He just sat there, watching me in the rearview mirror. I could feel his eyes on me, and I knew I had to act fast. I looked around, searching for anyone who could help. But we were still in the middle of nowhere, the road stretching out in both directions, empty and desolate. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and I felt the creeping terror that I was truly alone out here with this man. "Get back in!" he called out, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I glanced at the car, at the trunk, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. There was no way I was getting back in that car. Not after what I'd heard. "I'm fine," I stammered, backing away slowly. "Thanks for the ride, but I'll walk from here." He didn't reply. He just stared at me, unblinking, his hand resting on the steering wheel. And that's when I knew I had to run. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me as I backed further away from the car, my heart racing in my chest. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but I knew I had to play it smart. If I sprinted off too quickly, I'd give myself away. He could easily catch up to me with the car, and I'd be trapped all over again. But then I heard it again, another faint cry from the trunk. This time, there was no mistaking it. Someone was back there, someone desperate and afraid. My throat tightened with fear, but I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "Get back in the car," the man said again, his voice cold, sharper now. There was an edge to it, a warning. I shook my head, my legs trembling beneath me. "No, I'm good," I managed, stepping backward. "I'll walk." "I don't mind." His eyes flicked to the side mirror for a split second, and I knew then that he was calculating his next move. My mind raced. There had to be a way out, something I could do to get out of this situation alive. And then, almost as if fate was on my side, I saw it in the distance, headlights. They were faint, barely a glimmer on the horizon, but it was enough. Another car was coming, and it might be my only chance. I had to make it look like I wasn't panicking, that I wasn't onto him. But inside, the fear was threatening to swallow me whole. I forced myself to smile, a weak, pitiful thing, but enough to throw him off for a moment. "Thanks again," I muttered, turning away and taking another few steps back toward the road. I heard the car door creak open behind me, and my stomach dropped. He was getting out. "Run." I bolted, my boots slipping on the icy road as I pushed my legs to go faster. I could hear him shouting behind me, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. The car wasn't far now, maybe 100 yards away. If I could just make it there. Suddenly, I felt a hand grab the back of my coat, yanking me backward with such force that I almost fell. My heart leapt into my throat, and I twisted around, kicking out wildly. My foot connected with his shin, and he let out a grunt of pain, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, ignoring the burning in my lungs, the cold biting into my skin. The approaching car's headlights grew brighter, and I waved my arms frantically, praying they'd see me, that they'd stop. The car slowed, and I could have cried from relief. I stumbled toward it as the window rolled down, revealing an older woman behind the wheel. "Please help me," I gasped, my voice trembling. He's got someone in the trunk." The woman's eyes widened in shock, and she immediately pulled over to the side of the road, beckoning me inside. I glanced behind me to see the man standing still, his face obscured by the shadows, watching me. He wasn't chasing me anymore, but something about his calm stillness terrified me even more. I scrambled into the woman's car, slamming the door behind me. My entire body was shaking, the adrenaline coursing through my veins making it hard to think straight. She asked me what had happened, but all I could do was point back toward the man in the car. "He's got someone in the trunk," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper now. Without another word, she floored the gas, and we sped down the road toward the nearest diner, where she said we could call the police. My mind raced as we drove, flashes of the man's expression haunting me. What would happen to the person trapped in the trunk? What if it was already too late? When we finally reached the diner, the warm lights glowing through the frosty windows felt like salvation. We rushed inside, and the woman immediately called the police while I collapsed into a booth, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. The hours that followed felt like a blur, sirens, flashing lights, police officers questioning me. They went back to where I'd left the man, but when they got there, the car was gone. Vanished into the night, just like that. But I could still hear those screams, those faint, desperate cries from the trunk, echoing in my mind. It was 2005, and I was 18, just a college kid who thought I had the world figured out. I was on my way to visit a friend in San Antonio, driving an old, beat-up pickup truck I inherited from my parents. It was one of those old Fords that rattled when it went over 60 miles per hour, but I loved it. It had character, you know? Like something that held memories of all the places it had been. I didn't mind the creaks and groans because, in some strange way, it felt like a connection to my family. That night, I had been on the road for hours. I had made it through Uvalde and was cruising along Route 90, a desolate stretch of road that I knew nothing about. It was late, probably around 11 p.m., and the moon was barely visible through a thick layer of clouds. The road stretched out endlessly ahead of me, flanked by dark, shadowy woods on both sides. No streetlights, no signs of civilization, just me, my old truck, and the road. It felt like I was driving through some forgotten part of the world where time didn't matter, and no one would ever know if something went wrong. And something did go wrong. My gas gauge had been flirting with empty for the past 20 miles, but I thought I'd be fine. After all, I'd made this drive before and never had a problem. I kept telling myself there had to be a gas station around the next bend, but bend after bend, nothing came. That's when my truck let out a deep groan, sputtered, and then died, right there in the middle of nowhere. The headlights dimmed, the engine cut off, and I rolled to a stop on the side of the road. I tried starting it again, but all I got was that terrible clicking noise of a dead engine. Panic hit me like a freight train. I was stranded, alone, and I had no idea where the next town was. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. This was 2005, before everyone had GPS and reliable cell service. I was miles away from the last town, and the road ahead stretched into a void. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and decided the only thing I could do was wait for someone to pass by. For the next hour, I sat in that truck, staring into the darkness, hoping for headlights. The wind howled outside, and every creak of the trees made my skin crawl. I had never been afraid of the dark before, but that night, something felt wrong. Maybe it was the isolation or the way the shadows moved when the wind shifted the branches. Maybe it was the eerie silence that hung in the air, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. I don't know. But I had a gnawing feeling in my gut that I wasn't alone. It was about an hour later when I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining it. There was a figure walking toward me on the side of the road, slowly, deliberately. He came out of the darkness like a ghost, illuminated only by the dim glow of my truck's hazard lights. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, and wearing a long coat that billowed behind him in the wind. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could tell by the way he moved that he wasn't in a hurry. He was calm. Too calm. I rolled down my window slightly, my heart pounding in my chest as he approached. I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. He stopped a few feet away from the driver's side, his face still obscured in the shadows. For a moment neither of us spoke. I was waiting for him to say something, anything that would give me an idea of who he was and what he wanted. Finally, he broke the silence. "Need some help?" His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was something off about it. Something cold. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I ran out of gas. Do you know if there's a gas station nearby?" He took a step closer, and that's when I noticed his eyes. They were dark, too dark, like pools of ink in the dim light. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering my question. "No stations for miles," he said. His voice was still calm, but there was a hint of amusement in it now, like he knew something I didn't. I swallowed hard. "Do you have a phone? Maybe you could call for help." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat, and for a split second, I thought he was going to pull out a phone. But what he pulled out was a knife. A long, rusted blade that caught the faint light from the truck's hazard lights. My heart stopped. "Why don't you empty your pockets first?" he said, his voice low and menacing now. I froze. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I didn't have much, just my wallet with a few bucks in it and my phone, which was practically useless with no signal. But it wasn't about the money. It was the way he looked at me, like he was enjoying this. Like this was a game to him. I don't have much," I stammered, hoping to buy some time. My hand instinctively reached for the door handle, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. Not with that knife in his hand. "Doesn't matter," he said, taking another step closer. "Just hand it over." That's when instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I flung open the door and bolted out of the truck, sprinting toward the woods. I could hear him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran. The trees closed in around me as I stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at my face and arms. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear him crashing through the woods behind me, his footsteps growing louder with each passing second. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep running. As I dashed through the woods, panic clouded my thoughts. I could hear the man's footsteps behind me, crunching leaves, snapping twigs, and I knew he was close. Too close. The moon barely illuminated the forest floor, making every step treacherous. I stumbled several times, my feet catching on roots and rocks, but I forced myself to keep going. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, and my mind was spinning with terror. The only thing keeping me going was the thought that if I stopped, I wouldn't live to see morning. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. I slowed my pace, still trying to stay as quiet as possible, and eventually ducked behind a large tree. My heart was pounding in my ears, and my breaths came in ragged gasps. I crouched down, hoping the thick trunk would hide me from view. I couldn't hear him anymore. Had I lost him? For a moment I allowed myself to hope. Maybe he had given up. Maybe he had gone back to the road. I peered around the tree, trying to catch a glimpse of any movement in the dark woods. But all I saw were shadows and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the branches. I waited for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of him. The forest was eerily silent now, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I strained my ears, but there was nothing. No footsteps. No voices. Just silence. I was alone. Cautiously, I stood up, wincing at the pain in my legs. I had no idea where I was. The woods all looked the same, endless trees in every direction. My truck felt like a distant memory, and I wasn't even sure I could find my way back if I tried. But I couldn't stay here. Not in the open like this. I started walking again, this time more slowly, trying to keep my footsteps as quiet as possible. The woods seemed to go on forever, and I had no sense of direction. Every time I thought I was making progress, the landscape would shift, and I'd find myself surrounded by more trees, more darkness. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a clearing. The clearing wasn't much, a small patch of open ground surrounded by trees that loomed like sentinels in the dark. But to me, it felt like a lifeline. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to piece together what had just happened. My mind was racing, my body aching, but all I could think about was that man, that knife, and how close I had come to. I didn't even want to finish that thought. I had to keep moving. Staying in one place felt like a death sentence. Every shadow, every rustling leaf, seemed to hide him, waiting to strike when I let my guard down. My pulse was still hammering, but I forced myself to focus. "Just get back to the road," I whispered to myself. "Find help." But even as I said it, I knew how slim my chances were. I had no idea where the road was. The trees were dense, and everything looked the same. My phone was still in my pocket, but it was useless out here with no signal. I was truly alone. Or so I thought. As I was about to step forward, something caught my eye, a faint light flickering in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It wasn't much, just a small glow, but in the pitch-black darkness, it was like a beacon. Hope surged through me, and without thinking, I headed toward it. The forest thinned as I walked, and the light grew brighter, steadier. My steps quickened. Maybe it was a house, or a campsite. Anything that meant other people. Someone who could help. But as I approached, my hope turned to dread. The light was coming from a small, dilapidated shack. It looked ancient, like something that had been abandoned for decades. The wooden walls were warped and covered in moss, the roof sagging under the weight of time. A single lantern hung from a rusted hook on the porch, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. Something felt wrong. Terribly wrong. I stopped in my tracks, my heart thudding in my chest. Why was there a light on? Out here, in the middle of nowhere? The shack looked like it should have been deserted, forgotten by the world. But someone was here. Someone had to have lit that lantern. I didn't want to go any closer. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get as far away from this place as possible. But where would I go? Back into the woods? Back to the man with the knife, who could still be out there, hunting me? I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The wooden porch creaked under my weight as I approached the door. The lantern swung gently in the wind, casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. Before I could touch it, the door swung open. I jumped back, my heart in my throat. But no one was there. The door had opened on its own, or at least, that's what I told myself. I peered inside, my eyes struggling to adjust to the dim light. The interior was just as decrepit as the outside, dusty, filled with cobwebs, and reeking of mildew. But something else caught my attention. In the center of the room was a table. On it lay my wallet and my phone. I froze. How was that possible? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I had left those things in my truck, hadn't I? Or maybe they had fallen out when I ran? But no, that didn't explain how they were here, in this shack, neatly placed on a table like someone had been waiting for me to find them. I backed away, my skin crawling with fear. This wasn't right. None of this was right. That's when I heard it, a low, raspy voice from somewhere inside the shack. "Why did you run?" I spun around, my blood turning to ice. The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was him. The man from the road. He was here. I couldn't see him, but I could feel his presence, like the air in the room had grown heavier, suffocating. My hands trembled as I backed toward the door, my eyes darting around the room, searching for him. But the shadows were thick, and every corner seemed to hide something sinister. "Thought you could get away?" he rasped, the voice closer now, coming from somewhere in the dark recesses of the shack. "Nobody gets away." I bolted for the door, but before I could reach it, something cold and hard clamped around my wrist. I screamed, trying to yank my arm free, but his grip was like iron. He stepped out of the shadows, his face twisted in a sick grin, the knife gleaming in his other hand. I kicked and struggled, my pulse hammering in my ears. His grip tightened, and I could feel the knife press against my side, cold and sharp. "Please!" I gasped, desperation taking over. "I don't have anything. Just let me go." But he just laughed, a low, cruel sound that sent chills down my spine. "This isn't about what you have," he whispered, his breath hot on my skin. "It's about what you'll give me." I didn't want to know what he meant. I didn't want to find out. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I twisted my body and lashed out with my free hand, punching him square in the jaw. He let out a grunt of surprise and loosened his grip just enough for me to slip free. I didn't look back. I sprinted out of the shack and into the woods, my legs burning, my heart racing. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the trees, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness swallowing me whole. I didn't know where I was going, just away from him. Away from the nightmare. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled back onto the road. My truck was still there, exactly where I had left it. But something was different. The hood was open, and my gas canister was lying empty on the ground. I didn't care. I jumped into the driver's seat and prayed that the engine would start. When I turned the key, the truck roared to life. Relief washed over me as I slammed the gas pedal and sped down the road, leaving that nightmare behind. It wasn't until I reached the next town that I realized something was missing. My wallet. My phone. They were still in that shack, waiting for me. But I wasn't going back. I never did tell my friend in San Antonio what happened that night. Hell, I never told anyone. But sometimes, when I'm alone on a dark road, I think about that man. About the way he looked at me. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for his next victim. I made it out alive. But I don't think the next person will be so lucky. You never really think it'll happen to you. You hear stories on the news, watch movies about women stranded on dark, lonely roads, but it's always someone else. I used to feel that way too, until it happened to me one cold night driving home after a long shift. My name is Emily Harrington, and I live in a quiet corner of North Carolina, out near the woods where the roads wind and twist through long stretches of nothingness. That night, I was exhausted. It had been another 12-hour shift at the hospital, and my body was aching in places I didn't even know could ache. The last thing I wanted was to take the long, deserted road back home, but it was the quickest way, and all I could think about was my bed. It was around midnight when I left the hospital, the air thick with a creeping fog. I was about halfway home, driving through one of those stretches where there's nothing but trees and darkness, when I noticed something wasn't right. The car started sputtering, like it was gasping for breath. At first, I thought it was just the engine acting up. I'd had trouble with it before, but when the car came to a complete stop, I knew something else was wrong. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. I tried starting the engine again, nothing. I cursed under my breath and glanced at my phone. Of course, no signal. There wasn't a single car in sight, not a single light ahead or behind me. Just the suffocating darkness pressing in. I had a choice to make: wait in the car for someone to pass by or try walking back to the gas station I'd passed about a mile down the road. That's when I saw him. Out of nowhere, a man appeared at the edge of the road, walking towards me. I hadn't heard any footsteps, hadn't seen him coming, and my heart immediately jumped into my throat. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him felt off, like a wrong note in a familiar song. He wasn't just some guy out for a midnight stroll. No one would be walking down this road in the middle of the night. I locked the doors and pretended to be busy with my phone, but it was impossible to ignore him as he approached my car. He came right up to the driver's side window, his breath fogging the glass as he leaned in. "You need help?" His voice was calm, too calm, and something about the way he spoke made my skin crawl. I shook my head, giving him a tight-lipped smile. "No, I'm fine. I've already called for help." I hadn't, of course, but I wasn't about to let him know that. He didn't move. His eyes darted to the back seat, then back to me, as if sizing up the situation. "You sure? I can give you a ride. There's a gas station not too far from here." I shook my head again, this time more firmly. "Really, I'm fine. My husband's on his way." He stared at me for a moment longer, and I could feel the air in the car grow thick with tension. Then, slowly, he smiled, a tight, unsettling grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, alright then," he said, backing away. "You take care now." I watched him walk back down the road, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as he'd appeared. My hands were shaking, and I was grateful the doors were locked. Something about the encounter gnawed at me, like a warning bell ringing faintly in the back of my mind. I sat in the car for a few more minutes, hoping another car would come by, but no one did. It was like I was the only person left in the world. I finally decided to take a look at the car. Maybe it was something simple, and I could at least try to fix it before making the long walk back to the gas station. I popped the hood and got out, stepping into the cold night air. As I looked under the hood, my stomach sank. The fuel line had been cut, deliberately. Panic surged through me. That man had done this. There was no other explanation. I was stranded, alone, and whoever that man was, he knew exactly what he was doing. My mind raced as I slammed the hood shut and got back in the car, locking the doors again. I couldn't stay here. If he came back, I didn't know what he might try. I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw the second man. He was standing about 50 yards away, just at the edge of the trees, watching me. He wasn't moving, just standing there staring. My heart felt like it might explode out of my chest. I couldn't stay in the car, it wasn't safe. But leaving felt even more dangerous. I thought about making a run for it, but where would I go? The only place nearby was an old farmhouse I'd seen about a half-mile back. It wasn't much, but it was better than staying out here, waiting for him to make his move. Grabbing my keys and phone, I slipped out of the car as quietly as I could. I kept my eyes on him the entire time, hoping he wouldn't start moving toward me. My legs felt like jelly as I started walking, then jogging, down the road toward the farmhouse. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see him chasing after me, but he just stood there, watching. By the time I reached the farmhouse, I was out of breath and shaking. I banged on the door, praying someone would answer. After what felt like an eternity, a woman in her 60s opened the door. She had kind eyes, and for the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. "Please, I need help. My car broke down, and there's a man out there," I blurted out, my words tumbling over each other. She didn't ask any questions, just stepped aside and let me in. The warmth of the house hit me like a wave, and I nearly collapsed with relief. "You poor thing," she said, leading me to the kitchen. "You must be freezing. Let me get you something warm to drink." She bustled about, making tea while I sat at the table, trying to catch my breath. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the man from the road standing there, but all I could see was the dark outline of my car in the distance. When she handed me the cup of tea, something inside me hesitated. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the lingering fear from my encounter with the man, or maybe it was the way she was watching me just a little too closely, but I didn't drink it. I just held the cup in my hands, letting the warmth seep into my skin. I told myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. The air in the house felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I could hear the tick of a clock somewhere in the living room, each second dragging on longer than the last. The woman, she hadn't told me her name, sat across from me, her eyes never leaving mine as I held the untouched cup of tea in my hands. "Go ahead, dear," she urged, smiling sweetly. "It'll help calm your nerves." I nodded, but still didn't drink. My mouth had gone dry, my throat tight with unease. There was something about the way she was looking at me that made me want to run again, but where would I go? Outside was worse, and I had no idea who this woman really was. "I think I should try calling my husband again," I stammered, setting the cup down and reaching for my phone. As my trembling fingers reached for the phone, I couldn't shake the growing dread pooling in my stomach. The woman's smile wavered just slightly, barely perceptible, but enough to set my nerves on fire. I tapped at my phone screen, praying for service, but just like before, nothing. No bars, no lifeline. My heart was pounding in my chest like it was trying to claw its way out. "You sure you don't want the tea, dear?" she asked again, her voice sweet, but there was an edge to it now, something almost mechanical in the way she spoke. "I'm okay, thank you," I forced out, trying to sound polite. I needed to think. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was coming next. The farmhouse felt more suffocating by the second. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed louder, more deliberate, like a countdown. The windows rattled softly in the wind, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and something else, something faint but metallic, almost like rust. I tried to focus, to think logically, but my mind kept circling back to the tea. The way she had insisted I drink it, the way her eyes followed my every move, it all felt wrong. There was something off about this whole situation, and I wasn't going to wait around to find out what. "I think I should wait by the door," I said suddenly, standing up. "My husband's probably on his way. He's got a pretty good sense of direction." Her eyes flickered, the pleasant mask slipping for just a second. "Don't be silly," she said, standing too quickly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "You'll catch cold out there. Just stay here a little longer, he'll be along soon enough." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of that house. I made a move toward the front door, but she stepped in front of me, her small frame blocking my path. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the tension so thick it was hard to breathe. Her smile was gone now, replaced by something darker, something calculating. "I've been nothing but hospitable, and here you are, acting like I'm some kind of villain," she said quietly, almost to herself. My heart sank. I knew then that whatever kindness she'd shown me was just a mask, and now that I'd refused her, the real face was starting to show. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just scared. It's been a rough night, and I just..." Before I could finish, there was a loud bang on the front door. Both of us froze. My heart leapt into my throat, but then a new fear took over. Was it him? The man from the road? Had he followed me all this way? The woman's eyes darted toward the door, and for a brief moment, she seemed genuinely rattled. Her hand twitched toward a drawer near the kitchen. Was she reaching for something? A weapon? The knock came again, harder this time, and I could hear a muffled voice calling from outside. "Emily?" My knees nearly gave out. It was Derek. My husband. Relief flooded through me so fast I felt lightheaded. "Derek!" I called, rushing to the door, but the woman's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist with surprising strength. "You're not leaving," she hissed, her voice low and dangerous now. "Not yet." Fear washed over me in waves as I struggled to pull my arm free, her grip like iron. She wasn't the frail old woman she seemed to be. There was something much darker behind those eyes. "Let go of me!" I shouted, trying to wrestle free. The banging on the door grew louder. Derek was pounding on it now, calling my name over and over. The woman's grip tightened painfully, her eyes wild with something I couldn't place. Rage? Desperation? I did the only thing I could think of. With my free hand I grabbed the mug of tea from the table and threw it in her face. The hot liquid splashed across her skin, and she let out a shriek, releasing me as she stumbled backward. I didn't wait to see what she'd do next. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock before yanking it open and practically falling into Derek's arms. "What the hell happened? Are you okay?" he asked, his voice frantic as he held me up. I was shaking too hard to respond. All I could do was point back at the house, where the woman stood in the doorway, her face red and twisted with fury. Derek's eyes followed mine, and when he saw her, his face darkened. "Get in the car," he said, his voice cold now, protective. I didn't argue. I hurried to the car, my legs barely able to carry me. Derek stayed on the porch, facing her down, but she didn't move. She just stood there, watching us, her eyes burning with something like hate. When Derek finally got in the car, he didn't say a word. He just started the engine and peeled out of the driveway, the tires kicking up gravel as we sped away. I sat there in silence, my heart still racing, my mind replaying everything that had happened. I wanted to tell Derek everything, but I couldn't find the words. All I knew was that I'd escaped something terrible that night, something far worse than just a broken-down car and a strange man on the road. We didn't stop until we were back home, our small, cozy house suddenly feeling like the safest place in the world. Derek sat beside me on the couch, holding me close, and for the first time since the night began, I felt like I could finally breathe. "Do you think she—" I started, but I couldn't finish the question. "Did she poison the tea? Was it all some twisted plan?" "I don't know," Derek said, his voice low. "But we're not going back to find out." For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed by a dark window, I expected to see her standing there, those cold, calculating eyes staring back at me. I never saw her again, but that night left a mark on me that I'll never forget. The farmhouse, the man on the road, the cut fuel line, it was all part of something bigger, something I still don't fully understand. All I know is sometimes the darkness holds more than just shadows, and you're never as alone as you think.